The first meditation seemed to have ended in despair. The next day, Descartes returns to his philosophical ruminations and goes over his reasoning of the previous day. Let's do the same. It all began when he noticed that he has been wrong about many things in the past, and wondered what he might be wrong about in the present. He wonders whether there is some way to prevent error once and for all. He hits on the idea that if he only accepted what it's impossible to doubt, then he could be sure that whatever he believed would have to be true. This is the method of doubt. He begins by assuming that everything he believes is false, and only readopts a belief if it can't possibly be doubted. This is a kind of intellectual housekeeping. But since he can't go through all his beliefs one by one, he decides to evaluate their sources. These are sensory experience and reason. But sensory experience is not 100% reliable, since it's possible it's all dream experience. So he cannot accept any beliefs he forms on the basis of his sensory experience, including empirical scientific ones. But reason is not 100% reliable either, since it's possible that the faculty of reason itself is defective due to the influence of an evil demon who is bent on deceiving him in the things that seem to him to be the most clear. So perhaps the quest for certainty has failed. But then Descartes realizes that he's missed something. There's something that he can be certain of even if his senses and reason are unreliable. Something that was true and beyond doubt even as he pursued his extreme skepticism, namely, that he exists. This could not be doubted because the very act of trying to doubt it proves it to be true. Doubting is a form of thinking, and he couldn't be thinking anything at all if he didn't exist. So, if he is thinking, it follows that he must exist. This is the famous I think, therefore I am, or, in Latin, cogito ergo sum. Even if the evil demon could not make it... But then he realizes that he's missed something. There is something that he can be certain of, even if his senses and his reason are unreliable. Something that was true and beyond doubt, even as he pursued his extreme skepticism. Namely, he exists. This cannot be doubted because the very act of trying to doubt it proves it to be true. Doubting is a form of thinking, and he couldn't be thinking anything at all if he didn't exist. So if he is thinking, it follows that he must exist. This is the famous I think, therefore I am, or, in Latin, cogito ergo sum. Even the evil demon could not make his belief that he exists false while he's thinking it. The evil demon could not make him falsely believe that he exists, because if he's thinking anything, even if he's thinking that he doesn't exist, he must exist. As long as he is thinking, Descartes reasons, it's absolutely certain that he exists. He writes,
"There is, I know not what being, who is possessed at once of the highest power and the deepest cunning, who is constantly employing all his ingenuity in deceiving me. Doubtless, then, I exist, since I am deceived. And let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall be conscious that I am something."
So this belief, I exist, can serve as the absolutely certain foundation of all possible knowledge. But is this all he can know? Is it possible to get beyond this? Is there a way to save mathematics and empirical science too? Descartes realizes that since the only reason he found for doubting the reliability of logic and mathematics was the possibility of an evil demon, so if he can eliminate this possibility, mathematics and logic at least will be secured. But how can the possibility of an evil demon be eliminated? Descartes thinks that if he can prove that God exists, then that would show that there is no evil demon. And if there is no evil demon, he no longer has a basis for doubting the reliability of reason and the truths of logic and mathematics. Whatever is clearly and distinctly conceived must be true. Descartes gives the following argument, which is called the ontological argument, for the existence of God. Premise 1. It is absolutely certain that I have a concept or an idea of God. of a perfect supreme being. That is, Descartes can be certain. It is absolutely certain that I have a concept or an idea of God, of a perfect or supreme being. That is, Descartes can be certain that he has an idea of God or a perfect being because he's directly aware of it in his conscious experience. Even if there's no God in reality, it is absolutely certain that his idea of God exists in his mind. However, he continues, only a perfect thing could cause the idea of perfection. Here Descartes is appealing to a principle formulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, namely that if a thing x causes another thing y to have a property p to degree n, then x must have p at least to degree n. For example, if you put a pot of water over a flame and the water boils, the flame must have been at least 212 degrees Fahrenheit, since that's the temperature water has to be if it's boiling. We will encounter this Aristotelian principle again when we study St. Thomas Aquinas. Applying this principle to his concept of God, Descartes concludes that only a perfect thing could have caused it to exist in his mind. This concept must have originated from something perfect. However, he is not perfect. Hence, his concept of God, of a perfect being, came from something that is not him and that is actually perfect. Therefore, such a being, God, exists. Convinced? Descartes then goes on to argue that since God is supremely good, he would not have created us with completely flawed natures. And so, though we do make mistakes, we can't always be wrong, especially about what's clear and distinct or self-evident, that is, logic and mathematics. The existence of a benevolent creator guarantees the reliability of reasoning and mathematical judgments, since by our very nature it's impossible for us to really understand the denials of true mathematical propositions. Here's how Descartes argues for the reliability of reasoning. If we were always wrong in our mathematical and logical judgments, then our God-given nature would be defective. We would always be deceived. But God is supremely good, and is therefore not a deceiver. So, he did not create us with minds that are so defective. So, we can't be wrong in our careful judgments about mathematical and logical propositions. They're true and couldn't possibly be false. And here's how Descartes argues for the overall reliability of our senses. If we were always wrong in our judgments about the existence of an external world and what it's like, then our God-given nature would again be defective, and we would always be deceived. But, again, God is no deceiver. Therefore, he did not create us with senses that are so defective. Hence, we can't be wrong in our belief that there is an external world, and we couldn't always be wrong about what the world is like. In short, God is good and God created us, so we can't always be wrong about everything. Though we do make mistakes, it's inconsistent with the goodness of God that we're always wrong and cannot correct our mistakes. The existence and goodness of God guarantees the basic reliability of reason and ordinary sense perception. What we understand clearly and distinctly, what is self-evident, could not possibly be false. And our powers of reasoning give us a way to explain why we are prone to error, both in reasoning and in perception, and hence enable us to devise ways of preventing errors. And if sense perception is basically reliable, then all the sciences that are based on it, physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, and the like, can also be a source of genuine knowledge. So Descartes thinks he's solved the skeptical problems he raised in the first meditation, and has put mathematics, science, and ordinary sense perception on a firm and unshakable foundation. The unshakable foundation is his certain knowledge that he exists. He builds on this belief by identifying his concept of a perfect being, and proving that such a being must exist. Since a perfect being must be supremely good, he would not have created us with fundamentally flawed natures. So, our sensory and rational capacities must be fundamentally reliable, and it's possible to acquire knowledge through the exercise of them. However, if God is all-powerful and supremely good, why would he allow us to make any errors at all? Why didn't he make us intellectually perfect? How do we reconcile the possibility of error with the supreme goodness of God? This is known as the problem of error, and it threatens to undermine Descartes' argument for God's existence, and therefore his project of putting all human knowledge on a firm and absolutely certain foundation. It's related to the famous problem of evil, which we'll encounter again when we study Aquinas. The problem of evil is this: if God is supremely good and all-powerful and all-knowing, and he created everything, where does evil come from? Some philosophers have taken this to show that there is no God, no supremely good, all-powerful, all-knowing creator of everything, since if there were, it seems there couldn't be any evil. And you might think the problem of error also casts doubt on God's existence. If God is supremely good and created us, why do we make any mistakes at all? But Descartes has a solution to this problem. In the case of our beliefs based on reasoning, he says that we make mistakes when we believe things without fully understanding them. We can believe things without fully understanding them because believing is in our voluntary control. It's a matter of free will. So we must always withhold assent until we fully understand. We should not rush to judgment before seriously considering a question. If we make mistakes in reasoning, it's our own fault, not God's. Some philosophers have argued that the problem of evil has a similar solution. Evil comes from us when we exercise our free will and do bad things. Errors in perception are possible because we're all composites of mind and body. Our bodies are material. They're located in space and have spatial extension. Our minds, on the other hand, are immaterial and are not located in space and have no spatial extension. But the mind and the body are joined within the brain. The mind inhabits, controls, and monitors the body, and the mind is aware of what's happening in its body and can determine whether it is good or bad. The mind receives information about the body through the stimulation of nerve fibers. Because our bodies take up space, nerves have to be extended to connect parts of the body to the brain and mind. So, for example, if you burn your foot, a signal is sent to the brain, causing pain to occur in the mind. But because of this, it's possible that some connecting nerve closer to the brain could be stimulated in exactly the same way it would be stimulated if it were communicating a pain message to the brain, when in fact there is no fire. This nerve impulse would register in the mind in the same way as an impulse from the foot too close to the fire. In that case, pain would be felt in the foot even though there is no damaging stimulus. It would be something like a pain illusion. In fact, things like this actually do happen. For example, in cases of what's called phantom limb pain. In these cases, nerves closer to the brain are stimulated in the same way they would be stimulated by nerves in a limb, an arm or a leg, but where the patient has lost the limb. The patient experiences a pain in the limb that no longer exists. That is, a pain illusion. Pain is felt where it's not occurring. This is possible because our bodies take up space and nerve pathways connecting the body and the brain can be stimulated at any point. Phantom limb pain is like a false alarm. Here's an analogy. Suppose you have a doorbell that works like this. There's a bell in the kitchen that's attached by a string to a handle hanging outside the door. The way it's supposed to work is that when someone pulls the string at the door, the bell rings in the kitchen. And the string has to extend from the door to the kitchen in order for this to happen. But this means it's possible for the string to be pulled not by somebody pulling the handle by the door, but by something in between the door and the kitchen. Your cat, for example. If this happened, you would mistakenly think there was someone at the door. And the possibility of this mistake is built in to the doorbell system. Descartes argues that the possibility of error in perception is in the same way built into our nervous system. nerves must be extended from the body to the brain if they are to serve their purpose. It's impossible for us to completely avoid error, given that we are a composite of mind and body, and that the body takes up space. This is how Descartes explains how the possibility of perceptual error is consistent with the goodness of God. Descartes has argued that because God is our creator and is supremely good, it's not possible that we're always wrong. It's not possible that what's really clear and distinct is false because God exists and the evil demon doesn't. It's not possible that we're completely wrong in trusting our senses because it's entirely natural for us to do so, and we can correct errors using reason. Descartes depends on God to get beyond his certain knowledge of himself and the contents of his mind, to validate reason, and to validate ordinary knowledge based on sense perception. Also, to restore logic and mathematics and science to their rightful places. Now everything is based upon the absolute foundation of his knowledge of his own existence. But there's a problem. Descartes claims that reasoning cannot be trusted and that the mathematical and logical beliefs on it aren't certain unless there is a benevolent God to guarantee them. That is, there's no evil demon. He then argues that there is such a God. But arguments rely on reasoning, which is the very capacity that Descartes says can't be trusted unless there is a benevolent God. So Descartes can't rely on reasoning until he proves that God exists. But he can't prove that God exists without relying on reasoning. We need God to get reason, but we need reason to get God. So there's a circularity in his argument. It begs the question of the reliability of reasoning. This problem is known as the Cartesian circle. To beg the question is not to ask or raise a question, or for a question to be suggested by the facts, or to beg to ask a question. To beg the question is to assume what you're trying to prove. It's a mistaken reasoning, a fallacy. It's also called circular reasoning. So here's how Descartes makes this mistake. He argues like this. We know that God exists because we can prove it. We can prove that God exists because logic is reliable. And logic is reliable because God is good. It's easier to see the mistake if we put the argument in a slightly different form. Premise 1, God is good. Therefore, logic is reliable. Therefore, we can use logic to prove that God exists. So, God exists. But notice that premise 1 can't be true unless the conclusion is true. God can't be good if God does not exist. So, to assert that God is good is already to assume that God exists. The first premise assumes that the conclusion is true. So the argument is circular. It begs the question of God's existence. So it looks like Descartes has not gotten beyond his certainty of his own existence. He's not shown that he can know anything beyond this. And it seems we're left with skepticism. He hasn't resolved the skeptical doubts he raised about mathematics, science, and ordinary experience. Most philosophers think that the skeptical problems Descartes raises in the first meditation still have not been solved.